Hello there, fellow travelers through the forgotten corners of mythology. Tonight, we're going to uncover one of the most misunderstood stories in all of ancient literature, a tale that has been deliberately twisted and misrepresented for thousands of years to hide an uncomfortable truth about divine justice and victim blaming. So please, settle yourself comfortably wherever you are tonight. Perhaps dim the lights and wrap yourself in your favorite blanket, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Are you listening from a cozy apartment in Stockholm as winter settles over the city? Perhaps from a quiet bedroom in Portland as rain begins to fall? Maybe you're in a small town in New Zealand, watching the first light of dawn creep across peaceful hills? Wherever you are, you're about to discover that the monster you've been taught to fear was actually the victim of one of mythology's greatest injustices, and that the goddess of wisdom committed one of the most cruel and senseless acts of victim blaming in all of ancient literature. If this exploration into mythology's darkest truth helps you question the stories you've been told about heroes and monsters, perhaps consider subscribing for more journeys through history's hidden narratives. And don't forget to like this video if it helps you drift into thoughtful sleep. Think you know the story of Medusa? Think she was a terrible monster who deserved to be slain by the heroic Perseus? Imagine discovering that everything you've been taught about this ancient tale is a lie designed to protect the reputation of the gods while demonizing an innocent victim. Imagine learning that Medusa was once a beautiful young woman whose only crime was being sexually assaulted by a god, and that her transformation into a monster was not divine justice but divine cruelty inflicted by a goddess who chose to punish the victim rather than the perpetrator. Imagine realizing that for thousands of years, we've been celebrating a story about a woman being blamed for her own assault, turned into a monster as punishment for being violated, and then killed by a hero who was praised for destroying what the gods had created in their own spite. This is the real story of Medusa, a tale so disturbing that ancient storytellers deliberately obscured its true meaning, creating one of history's most persistent examples of how powerful institutions rewrite narratives to protect themselves while sacrificing the innocent. Picture, if you will, ancient Greece around the 8th century BCE, when the great epic poems of Homer were being composed and the stories that would define Western literature for millennia were taking their final form. This was a world where gods walked among mortals, where divine power shaped human destiny in ways both wonderful and terrible, and where the line between justice and cruelty was often determined by whoever had the strength to enforce their will. The Greek pantheon was not a collection of benevolent deities devoted to human welfare, but rather a dysfunctional family of immortal beings whose personal dramas and petty rivalries regularly spilled over into the mortal world with devastating consequences for ordinary humans. Within this cosmic dysfunction lived the story of Medusa, originally not a monster at all but a mortal woman of extraordinary beauty who served as a priestess in the temple of Athena, the goddess of wisdom, warfare, and crafts. Medusa was one of three sisters known as the Gorgons, but unlike her immortal siblings Stheno and Euryale, she was born mortal and vulnerable to all the dangers that mortality entailed. Her beauty was legendary throughout the ancient world, particularly her magnificent hair that flowed like golden silk and caught the light in ways that made mortal men and immortal beings alike stop in wonder. But Medusa's beauty, rather than being a blessing, would prove to be her curse in a world where divine attention was rarely benevolent, and where a woman's virtue was always precarious. As a priestess of Athena, Medusa had taken sacred vows of chastity, dedicating her life to serving the virgin goddess in her temple on the Acropolis. She spent her days tending the sacred flame, maintaining the goddess's shrine, and participating in the rituals that honored Athena's wisdom and protection. It was a life of devotion and purpose, one that should have earned her divine protection rather than divine punishment. The tragedy that would destroy Medusa's life began with the attention of Poseidon, the god of the sea, earthquakes, and horses, whose violent temper and insatiable appetites made him one of the most dangerous figures in the Greek pantheon. Poseidon was Zeus's brother, wielder of the trident that could split the earth and raise tidal waves, a deity whose power was exceeded only by his lack of self-control and his complete disregard for the consequences of his actions on mortal lives. When Poseidon first saw Medusa in Athena's temple, he was immediately obsessed with possessing her, not out of love or genuine desire, but simply because her beauty represented a challenge to his unlimited power and appetites. The fact that she was a priestess sworn to chastity, the fact that she was under Athena's protection, the fact that she was in a sacred space dedicated to his niece, none of these considerations meant anything to a god who had never learned to accept the word no from anyone mortal or divine. Poseidon began pursuing Medusa with the relentless determination that characterized all his desires, appearing at the temple in various disguises, sending gifts and messages, and making increasingly explicit threats about what would happen if she continued to reject his advances. But Medusa, faithful to her vows and terrified of the consequences of betraying her goddess, continued to refuse his attentions, seeking refuge in the sacred spaces of the temple and praying to Athena for protection from her divine tormentor. The violation that would change everything occurred on a night when Medusa was alone in the temple, performing the evening rituals that honored Athena and prepared the sacred space for the next day's worship. According to the oldest versions of the myth, versions that were later suppressed or altered to make the story more palatable to audiences who preferred their myths to have clear heroes and villains, Poseidon appeared in the temple not as a seducer or suitor, but as a rapist. Using his divine power to overwhelm any resistance, Poseidon assaulted Medusa on the floor of Athena's own temple, violating not only the young priestess but also the sacred space that was supposed to offer sanctuary to those who sought the goddess's protection. The act was both a sexual assault and a massive insult to Athena's authority, a demonstration that Poseidon felt he could take whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it, regardless of divine law or sacred boundaries. When Medusa cried out for help, when she prayed desperately to Athena to save her from this violation, the goddess remained silent. When she begged for divine intervention to stop the assault that was happening in Athena's own temple, to one of Athena's own priestesses, the goddess of wisdom chose not to act. The silence from the deity who was supposed to protect the innocent, who was supposed to defend the violated, who was supposed to embody justice and wisdom, was as devastating as the assault itself. In the immediate aftermath of the rape, as Medusa lay broken and traumatized on the temple floor, she might have hoped that justice would finally be served, that Athena would appear to punish Poseidon for his crimes and restore her honor. Instead, what happened next would transform a terrible crime into an unspeakable injustice that would echo through mythology for thousands of years. When Athena finally appeared in her temple, when she finally acknowledged what had happened in her sacred space, her response was not to comfort the victim or punish the perpetrator. Instead, she focused her rage on Medusa herself, declaring that the priestess had somehow defiled the temple through her own violation, that she had broken her vows of chastity by being raped, and that she would be punished for allowing such pollution to occur in Athena's sacred space. The logic of Athena's response was so twisted, so fundamentally unjust, that it reveals the depths of divine cruelty and the ways that powerful institutions protect their own interests at the expense of their most vulnerable members. Rather than confronting her uncle Poseidon, rather than demanding justice from the god who had actually committed the crime, Athena chose to punish the victim because it was safer, easier, and more politically expedient than challenging another member of the divine family. Athena's punishment of Medusa was as creative as it was cruel, designed not just to remove the evidence of Poseidon's crime, but to transform the victim into something so monstrous that no one would ever think to question what had been done to her. The goddess of wisdom, she who was supposed to embody justice and rational thought, decided that the appropriate response to a rape in her temple was to turn the rape victim into a monster so hideous that anyone who looked upon her would be turned to stone. The transformation that Athena inflicted upon Medusa was a masterpiece of victim-blaming disguised as divine justice. The beautiful hair that had attracted Poseidon's unwanted attention was transformed into a writhing mass of venomous serpents that would strike at anyone who came too close. The lovely face that had inspired Poseidon's obsession was twisted into something so horrifying that a single glance would kill anyone who saw it. The graceful body that had been violated was changed into something that could never again know human touch or comfort. But the cruelest aspect of Athena's punishment was how it isolated Medusa from all human contact and compassion. By making her very appearance deadly, Athena ensured that Medusa could never tell her story to another living person, could never seek comfort or support from anyone who might have understood her suffering, could never find a community of people who might have challenged the injustice of what had been done to her. The transformation also served Athena's political purposes perfectly. By turning Medusa into a monster, the goddess had removed any evidence that her temple had been violated, eliminated any witness who might testify to Poseidon's crime, and created a narrative in which the rape victim became the villain of her own story. Instead of a tale about divine sexual assault and institutional cover-up, the story became one about a dangerous monster who threatened innocent people and deserved to be destroyed. The isolation that followed Medusa's transformation was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of her punishment. Banished from human society, unable to look upon another living being without killing them, she was forced to live alone with her trauma and her rage, never able to share her story or receive comfort from anyone who might have understood what she had endured. The serpents that replaced her hair became her only companions, creatures that reflected her own anger and pain but could offer no solace or understanding. The cave where Medusa was forced to live became a monument to Athena's injustice, filled with the stone statues of anyone unfortunate enough to encounter the woman who had been transformed into a weapon of divine cruelty. Each statue represented another life destroyed by the consequences of a crime that Medusa had never committed, another innocent person who had paid the price for the gods' refusal to take responsibility for their own actions. Living in constant awareness of her deadly power, Medusa experienced a form of psychological torture that was designed to be inescapable. Every moment of every day, she was reminded that she could never again experience normal human relationships, never again know love or friendship or even simple companionship. The very gift of sight, which should have allowed her to appreciate beauty and wonder in the world, had been turned into a weapon that she could never fully control. The mythological sources suggest that Medusa retained her human consciousness and emotions throughout her transformation, meaning that she was fully aware of what had been done to her and why. She understood that she was being punished for being the victim of a crime, that her monstrous appearance was Athena's way of ensuring that no one would ever question the goddess's version of events, and that her isolation was designed to prevent her from ever telling the truth about what had really happened in the temple. The rage that consumed Medusa during her years of exile was not the mindless fury of a monster, but the righteous anger of a woman who had been betrayed by the very institutions that were supposed to protect her. Her serpentine hair and deadly gaze became expressions of a fury that was entirely justified, weapons that she had never asked for but that represented her only means of striking back at a world that had treated her with such unspeakable cruelty. But even in her monstrous form, even after everything that had been done to her, Medusa remained vulnerable to further exploitation and abuse. The gods who had already destroyed her life were not finished with their victim, and they would soon find new ways to use her suffering for their own purposes. The arrival of Perseus, the so-called hero who would eventually kill Medusa, represented the final chapter in a story of systematic victimization that had begun with sexual assault and continued through divine abandonment, institutional cover-up, and social isolation. Perseus was not on a noble quest to rid the world of a dangerous monster. He was on an errand that had been orchestrated by the very gods who had created the monster in the first place. Perseus's quest to obtain Medusa's head was part of a complex divine conspiracy that involved multiple members of the Olympian pantheon, each of whom had their own reasons for wanting Medusa dead. For Athena, Perseus represented the perfect solution to a problem that she had created, but could not solve through her own actions. By encouraging a mortal hero to kill Medusa, Athena could eliminate the last witness to her own injustice, while maintaining the fiction that she was helping a noble hero achieve a worthy goal. The divine assistance that Perseus received for his quest was unprecedented in its scope and generosity, involving gifts from multiple gods who all seemed remarkably eager to help him succeed in killing a woman who had already suffered more than anyone should ever have to endure. Athena provided him with a polished bronze shield that would allow him to look upon Medusa's reflection without being turned to stone. Hermes gave him winged sandals that would allow him to fly and an adamantine sickle that could cut through anything. Hades provided him with a cap of invisibility that would allow him to approach his victim undetected. The level of divine support for Perseus's mission raises uncomfortable questions about the gods' motivations and about the true nature of heroism in Greek mythology. Why did the gods care so much about helping Perseus kill Medusa? Why were they so eager to provide him with every possible advantage in a battle against a woman who was already isolated and defenseless? The answer lies in understanding that Medusa's death was not the goal of a heroic quest, but the final stage of a cover-up that had begun with her rape and continued through her transformation. The method by which Perseus killed Medusa reveals the depths of cowardice and dishonor that characterized his supposedly heroic deed. using Athena's shield to avoid looking directly at his victim, wearing Hades' cap to remain invisible, and wielding Hermes' sickle to ensure a quick kill. Perseus approached Medusa while she slept and cut off her head before she even knew he was there. This was not a battle between a hero and a monster. It was an assassination carried out against a sleeping woman who had no chance to defend herself. The moment of Medusa's death represents the ultimate triumph of institutional power over individual justice, the final victory of the gods who had orchestrated her suffering from the beginning. As her head was severed from her body, as her consciousness was finally ended after years of torment and isolation, the last witness to Athena's injustice was silenced forever. The story that the gods wanted to tell about heroism and divine justice had been permanently secured through the simple expedient of murdering the victim who might have told a different version of events. But even in death, Medusa was not allowed the dignity of rest or peace. Her severed head became a trophy, a magical weapon that Perseus used to turn his enemies to stone, ensuring that her suffering would continue to serve the purposes of others even after her life had ended. The head that had once been beautiful, that had been transformed into something monstrous through no fault of her own, became an instrument of death wielded by the very people who had destroyed her life. The later use of Medusa's head as a symbol on Athena's shield represents perhaps the most grotesque example of victim blaming in all of mythology. The goddess who had punished an innocent woman for being raped, who had transformed a priestess into a monster rather than confronting the god who had committed the crime, now wore the image of her victim as a badge of honor. Athena's shield, decorated with Medusa's severed head, became a symbol not of justice or wisdom but of institutional power and the willingness of the powerful to sacrifice the innocent in order to maintain their own authority. The traditional heroic narrative that surrounds Perseus's killing of Medusa serves to obscure the reality of what actually occurred and to transform a story about injustice and victimization into one about courage and achievement. By portraying Perseus as a brave hero who saved the world from a terrible monster, the mythological tradition ensures that no one asks uncomfortable questions about why Medusa became a monster in the first place or whether her death was actually necessary or just. The celebration of Perseus as a hero requires a willful blindness to the circumstances that created his victim and to the institutional forces that made his mission possible. It requires accepting the premise that Medusa was somehow responsible for her own transformation, that her monstrous appearance reflected some inner evil rather than being the result of divine cruelty, and that her death was a victory for justice rather than the final act in a systematic cover-up. Modern re-examinations of the Medusa myth have begun to uncover the victim-blaming assumptions that underlie the traditional heroic narrative and to ask challenging questions about whose interests are served by celebrating Perseus while demonizing Medusa. Feminist scholars have pointed out that the story follows a depressingly familiar pattern in which a woman who has been sexually assaulted is blamed for her own victimization, punished for being the victim of a crime, and then killed when she becomes inconvenient to the very institutions that were supposed to protect her. The psychological dimensions of Medusa's story reveal a sophisticated understanding of trauma and its effects that was often missing from ancient literature. Her transformation into a monster can be read as a metaphor for the ways that sexual assault survivors are often treated by society, turned into something frightening and unacceptable, isolated from normal human contact, and blamed for their own suffering. The deadly power of her gaze represents the way that trauma survivors are often seen as dangerous or contaminating, people to be avoided rather than supported. The serpents that replaced Medusa's hair can be understood as symbols of the anger and pain that sexual assault survivors carry with them, emotions that society often finds uncomfortable and threatening. The cave where she was forced to live represents the social isolation that many trauma survivors experience, cut off from community and support by people who find their stories too disturbing or challenging to hear. The contemporary relevance of Medusa's story is perhaps most apparent in the ways that modern institutions continue to protect perpetrators while blaming victims, particularly in cases involving powerful men and vulnerable women. The pattern of institutional response that we see in Medusa's myth, where the victim is silenced, blamed, and punished while the perpetrator faces no consequences, remains depressingly common in contemporary society. The tendency to transform victims into monsters, to make them appear dangerous or untrustworthy in order to justify their mistreatment, continues to be a common strategy for institutions that want to avoid accountability for their failures to protect the vulnerable. The systematic suppression of victim narratives in favor of stories that celebrate perpetrators and their allies reflects the same impulses that led to Medusa being portrayed as a monster rather than as a victim. The divine politics that shaped Medusa's fate reveal how institutional relationships and power dynamics often determine who receives justice and who is sacrificed to maintain the stability of existing systems. Athena's decision to punish Medusa rather than confront Poseidon was based not on any consideration of justice or morality, but on her calculation of where her own interests lay and which course of action would be least disruptive to the existing power structure. The collaboration between multiple gods in Perseus's quest demonstrates how institutions often work together to eliminate inconvenient witnesses and suppress uncomfortable truths. The gods' willingness to provide Perseus with every possible advantage in his mission against Medusa shows how much they cared about ensuring that their version of events would never be challenged by someone who might tell a different story. The mythological tradition's treatment of Medusa's story also reveals how narratives can be shaped and reshaped over time to serve the interests of the powerful. The earliest versions of the myth may have presented a more complex and nuanced view of Medusa's fate, but later retellings increasingly emphasized her monstrous nature while downplaying or eliminating entirely any mention of how she became a monster in the first place. The process by which Medusa's story was transformed from a tale of victimization into one of heroic triumph illustrates how historical narratives are often written by the winners, shaped by people who have an interest in portraying themselves and their institutions in the most favorable possible light. The systematic removal of victim perspectives from mythological narratives reflects a broader pattern in human storytelling, where the voices of the powerless are silenced in favor of stories that celebrate the powerful. The artistic representations of Medusa throughout history reveal how visual culture has participated in the process of transforming victim into monster, focusing on her monstrous appearance while ignoring the circumstances that created that appearance. The countless paintings, sculptures, and other artworks that depict Medusa as a terrifying monster serve to reinforce the narrative that she was something to be feared and destroyed, rather than someone who deserved compassion and justice. The persistence of Medusa's image as a symbol of female danger and monstrosity speaks to deep-seated cultural anxieties about women's anger and the potential for victims to become threats to the institutions that have harmed them. The transformation of a rape victim into a symbol of female evil reveals how misogynistic attitudes can shape mythological narratives and continue to influence contemporary culture. But perhaps the most important lesson from Medusa's story is the recognition that monsters are often made, not born, and that the true villains in any story may not be the ones who appear most frightening. The real horror of Medusa's tale lies not in her serpentine hair or deadly gaze, but in the systematic injustice that created those features and the institutional cruelty that transformed a victim into a villain. The goddess Athena, celebrated for her wisdom and justice, revealed herself to be capable of spectacular cruelty and moral blindness when her own interests were at stake. The hero Perseus, praised for his courage and righteousness, proved willing to murder a defenseless woman in her sleep when doing so served his purposes and earned him divine favor. The entire apparatus of divine and heroic authority that supposedly existed to protect the innocent and punish the guilty showed itself to be corrupt, self-serving, and fundamentally unjust. As you settle into sleep tonight, consider how many other stories you've been told might need to be re-examined, how many other victims might have been transformed into villains by people who found it convenient to blame those they had harmed. Think about the institutions in your own world that claim to protect the innocent while actually serving their own interests. And remember that true justice often requires questioning the official narratives that we've been taught to accept without examination. Let Medusa's story remind you that wisdom means looking beyond surface appearances to understand the deeper truths that lie beneath, that real heroism involves standing up for victims rather than celebrating their destruction, and that the most important battles are often fought not against obvious monsters but against the institutional forces that create monsters out of victims. Sleep peacefully, knowing that recognizing injustice is the first step toward preventing it, and that every time we question a convenient narrative, we honor the memory of all the victims who have been silenced by the powerful throughout history. In the darkness of her eternal sleep, Medusa finally rests beyond the reach of those who used her suffering for their own purposes, her story serving as a permanent reminder that justice delayed is often justice denied, and that the true monsters are not always the ones who look monstrous.